Hi, I want to welcome all of you to the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center's Lakin Lecture Series on Antisemitism. I know so many of you, but I always feel like I should introduce myself. I am Lori Shepard. I am the Executive Director. And on behalf of myself, our Board of Directors, and all of the staff at Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, we just want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us tonight. We have a beautiful crowd here in person, and we have about as many online. So we love having everybody here and all those who are watching via live stream. Tonight is our third in the museum's 2024 four-part Lakin Lecture Series on anti-Semitism, and we are so grateful to all of those who have helped make this series possible. As you know, this work simply is not going to happen without organizational partners like Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona and the team here at the Tucson J, as well as individual partners such as Michael and Marcia Zakaria, and they are here with us tonight, and we're very excited about that. Michael has been a little bit down, and we welcome him back. And of course, I always want to acknowledge one very special donor whose support and vision have been here every step of the way. This individual established the Edwin and Alma Lakin Education Fund at the Jewish Community Foundation of Southern Arizona. She started this to honor her parents, Alma and Eddie, and their lifelong commitment to Holocaust education, the people of Israel, to Jewish life, and to combating anti-Semitism. This series is such an amazing way to honor the Lakin legacy. Just as Ed and Alma did in their own lives with their advocacy and social justice work, this series continues to tackle those tough topics, those that weigh heavily on our hearts and our minds. My hands are too dry to turn this page. There we go. So far this year, we have explored anti-Semitism and the threats to our democracy with Rabbi Jonah Pesner. He was here just before the election. We tackled anti-Semitism on campus with Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau. And tonight, we're going to welcome Amy Spitalnick. She's going to be in conversation with our own Lynn Davis as we take a long look at anti-Semitism and the importance of community building in this fight. As always with the Lakin Lecture Series, our goal tonight is not just to point out the challenges that we face. That just makes us become paralyzed by the magnitude. What we're here to do tonight is to think about those challenges and then find ways to equip ourselves with the tools that we need to fight, to combat those challenges together. As I mentioned before, tonight we are going to welcome Amy Spitalnick, who is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Amy faces these challenges daily, and she is a national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to find more just and inclusive American democracy. She previously served as the executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups that were responsible for the violence following the 2017 Unite the Right rally. Under Amy's leadership, IFA became a powerful national voice in the fight against white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and extremism. And its Charlottesville case emerged as a model for accountability. Amy also serves as the senior advisor on extremism to human rights first, on the advisory board for the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University, and on Bedrock's National Leadership Council. She has extensive experience in government, in politics, and in advocacy organizations, including as the communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, and served as spokesperson and advisor to the New York City Mayor. She has also worked for a number of federal, state, and local officials. She's worked on campaigns and with advocacy organizations, including as J Street's first press secretary. Amy frequently appears in the national media and has been awarded various fellowships and honors, including being named Women in Power Fellow at 92nd Street Y, a Truman National Security Project Fellow, and a City and State 40 Under 40 Rising Star, and a New York Jewish Week 36 under 36 changemaker. These are hard. You have to get better, like more simple awards. She said she doesn't qualify for that one anymore. No, we don't. I first saw Amy speak when she joined the Council of American Jewish Museums Forum, Museums Respond, just after October 7th, as we were all grappling with what we needed to do, what we should do, and still what we were feeling. And it was such a fabulous opportunity. And today, she's going to be in conversation with Lynn Davis. Lynn Davis directs the Rabbi Joseph H. Gumbiner Community Action Project at Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, where she creates partnerships with other civic, racial, ethnic, and faith communities who share the belief that we can only strengthen freedom and democracy by protecting civil rights and civil liberties for everyone. Inspired by the late Rabbi Gumbiner's commitment to social activism and racial justice, the Community Action Project fulfills an integral part of the museum's mission, that of collaborating with Tucson's diverse community to promote human rights. It is my honor to introduce these two amazing women to you tonight.
Test? Okay. Lori, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Amy, it really is a pleasure and an honor to be sharing the stage with you tonight. Folks accustomed to Jewish life, or folks familiar with Jewish life, are accustomed to the alphabet soup of our organizations and our institutions. We are here at the Tucson J, JPSA, Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona, is right across the parking lot. What role does the JCPA play in this ecosystem?
Thanks so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Grateful to Lori and to Lynn and the whole team, and to be a part of this series in which you've already heard from a number of my favorite partners and friends in this work, and I know you're hearing from Eric Ward, I think next month. And so it's just an honor and a privilege to get to be a part of this. JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, has been around for 80 plus years. It was really founded at a dark time in our history in 1944, recognizing that Jewish safety in the United States would only really be achieved in deep partnership and coalition with other communities that were facing threat. And that history of JCPA and of the broader movements that we've been a part of is really the story of, I think, how Jews in so many ways made America the safest place that we have ever been in our history. The sort of inclusive, pluralistic society that we helped fight for here alongside so many allies and partners has become inextricable with what has kept us safe in this country for so long. And so whether it was in, fighting for civil rights and leading the delegation of Jews in the March on Washington, co-founding the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights with the NAACP, of which we're still a very proud active member, or fighting for Soviet Jewry, fighting to protect our family in Israel, or so much more that has really been front and center in Jewish advocacy in America for 80 years. JCPA has been sort of at the core of building those Jewish and cross-community coalitions. For me, it's particularly meaningful to come into this role. I will say I started this role about a month before October 7th. Little did I know what I was walking into then and the ways in which our world would just change completely a month later. And now, of course, with the divisive election we just went through, the work of JCPA, both post-October 7th and post-election, feels even more existential in many ways. And it's also deeply meaningful for me. JCPA has really been a part of my own journey. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. I was deeply engaged in student activism through Hillel when I was in college, a number of years ago at this point, and I would attend these JCPA Hillel forums in college, where I really sort of understood and learned what advocacy meant. It drove so much of my own professional journey, even if much of it wasn't actually directly in the Jewish community. And so to years later get to come back to lead this organization and an organization that is really focused on the deep interconnection of Jewish safety and inclusive pluralistic democracy at this particular moment in our community's history and in our country's history feels like such an honor and such an opportunity. And our work is really rooted in how we tell that story and how we do that work, both mobilizing Jews for our democracy and for the rights and safety of all communities at a time when they are under threat in new and deeply challenging ways, and helping partners and allies understand why the fight against anti-Semitism, the fight for Jewish safety, is existential to protecting and advancing our own inclusive democracy and the rights and safety of all communities. And so it's this two-way street, this deeply connected, pluralistic, inclusive society that we are working towards, that we are fighting for, and that we know is inherent to our safety and the safety of all.
Is that all?
That's all we're trying to do.
Just that. So this year's Lakin Lecture Series is special. We framed it around this anti-Semitism and as Lori mentioned, and as you alluded to, we got to hear from Rabbi Jonah Pesner about anti-Semitism and democracy. We heard from Jacques Berliner-Blau about anti-Semitism on campus. Eric Ward and Nadine Epstein are coming in just a couple of weeks. How does this anti-Semitism and community fit into that framework?
So in many ways, these topics are inextricably linked, right? We can't talk about the fight against anti-Semitism without talking about any of these pieces. Democracy, campus, the deeply interconnected nature of hate, and the ways in which at the core of that community and coalition building is central, and the ways in which we sort of build and advance the coalitions that we need to fight anti-Semitism to protect our community require understanding how it intersects with democracy, how it intersects with other forms of hate, requires understanding how it's manifesting on college campuses and in so many other places. And so while we're here to talk about anti-Semitism and community, I suspect we're going to be talking about all of those other topics. I literally, I guess, wrote a report called Anti-Semitism and Democracy that came out last year.
We will link to it so you can all have a chance to read it.
And I think in many ways the themes that all four of these lectures focus on are highlighted there, the same way that they come up in each and everything that we do, because if we're going to be serious about fighting anti-Semitism, we can't do it alone. We need to understand that it's deeply interconnected with other forms of hate and with the future of our democracy, and that we need to confront it wherever and however it exists, from the right to the left and anywhere else on campus and beyond. And so I'm grateful that you all have brought these threads together through this lecture series, and I'm excited to sort of dig into how they all intersect.
Thank you. I'd like to hear more about your approach to coalition building. I mean, we often say that politics make for strange bedfellows, and I think partnerships do too sometimes. Do you have a specific philosophy that you would that you ascribe to, and how do you decide whom to partner with? And is anyone ever too outside the tent, depending on the issue?
So, this is in so many ways the question that the Jewish community and those who do this work of community relations or coalition or bridge building or whatever you want to call it, it has many different names, but ultimately it's about building the sorts of inclusive communities and coalitions we need to advance our safety and our broader values. This is the question that we've been grappling with, not just in the last year and a half since October 7th, but really for much longer than that. Who can be at the table? How do we stay at the table? What are the red lines? How do we figure out that across lines of difference and disagreement, where we can find those points of commonality to actually move the needle? And it's hard, and it's gotten much harder since October 7th, both because many of us are still in pain and trauma. There are 79 hostages, I believe, that still remain. A war is, while we currently have a very fragile quasi-ceasefire, it's a war that continues, and so many of us are actually still in the pain and the trauma that we first experienced on October 7th because there hasn't been real resolution. And we've seen, of course, the uptick in anti-Semitism that's happened here since, compounding a very significant crisis of anti-Semitism that existed long before October 7th. The cycle of violence from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh, which was the deadliest attack on our community in U.S. history, to Poway, to other attacks targeting other communities like El Paso and Buffalo, motivated by those same anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and racist conspiracy theories. And so we're in this pain and this trauma, and we're not alone in it, because we've seen how the hate and extremism that's become so pervasive and normalized in our society is not just impacting Jews, but so many others. And for me, that's how we actually start figuring out how we build these coalitions. The work in Charlottesville that I was really fortunate to get to do is probably the perfect example of why we need to build broad, inclusive coalitions for against anti-Semitism and against hate in all forms. When Nazis with torches were marching in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," it was really confusing to most of us. It was confusing to me. I had been working in the New York Attorney General's office. We were working on issues of hate crimes and extremism. It was a space that I thought I was pretty familiar with, and it was still jarring and confusing to see Nazis with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And many of us were asking, what does this even mean? This conspiracy theory rooted in the idea that Jews are seeking to replace the white race with brown and black people, immigrants, refugees, has become so pervasive in so much of our political and social media and other conversations in the years since Unite the Right, in the years since August of 2017, that what felt fringe and shocking then has now become really normalized. And we know, as I said earlier, it doesn't simply target the Jewish community, although we certainly have seen it target our community, as I mentioned, not just in Charlottesville, where the synagogue was surrounded with neo-Nazis with semi-automatic weapons chanting Sieg Heil, and they had to evacuate a Holocaust Torah scroll out the back door in America in the year 2017, or in Pittsburgh, where the synagogue was targeted in the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history, or rather the deadliest attack on Jews in U.S. history, because I would argue that some of the other mass shootings that followed in El Paso and Buffalo were also very deadly anti-Semitic and xenophobic and racist attacks, all motivated by the same hate. And so as we've seen this hate expand and these conspiracy theories, this invasion and replacement language that so motivated and fueled these attacks in very explicit ways, it's so clear how our safety and our future is deeply intertwined with that of the Black community, the Latino community, the Muslim community, and so many others. And of course, post-October 7th, we've also seen this very real, very severe spike in anti-Semitism as it relates to the Israel conversation. It's important to note that it's manifesting in different ways. On the right, it's been in the form of these acts of mass violence, far-right, white supremacist mass violence targeting synagogues or churches or other houses of worship or communities. On the left, it's been in the form of what we've seen happening on college campuses or in certain progressive coalitions or in synagogues or other Jewish institutions being targeted or held accountable for the actions of the Israeli government, including my own synagogue and my local Israeli American restaurant in Brooklyn just a few weeks ago. And what we're seeing there is effectively another form of sort of anti-democratic extremism in its worst senses, which is to say that Jews or anyone who has a relationship or connection to Israel aren't welcome in certain spaces, can't be part of some of the very coalitions that we need to advance our rights and our safety as Jews and of all communities at this dire moment. And so it's important to be clear-eyed about the threats and how they are manifesting differently across the political spectrum. And it's also important to note the ways in which these conspiracy theories around Jewish control and power are in fact showing up in different forms across the political spectrum, whether it's on the right in these normalized conspiracy theories about invasion and replacement, or on the left in efforts to effectively keep Jews out of the very coalitions and spaces that we need for all of us to be safe. And how we confront all of that and engage partners and allies is in understanding that deeply interconnected hate and the danger of breaking apart our coalitions at this crucial moment is how we sort of figure out where to start. I'm not sure if that actually answered the core of your question, but it's that framework that shapes how we are doing this work and sort of where we think we could have the greatest impact.
Thank you. I've heard, I've heard from you, we've had, wonderful speakers here, and each time when I hear someone do the litany of Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway, Colleyville, I mean, like all these things added together is astounding and disturbing. And then we come to October 7th. And I think a lot of people, I mean, as horrible as all those things were and are, I think a lot of us mark life in the Jewish community, relationships, et cetera, in a before and after October 7th. Talk a little bit about what the community relations field has looked like before and after, and some of those relationships.
So, I mean, I think you're exactly right. For me, and I imagine for most people in this room, if you're Jewishly engaged in any way, it was before and after. And no matter if you work in the Jewish world or not, if Israel is part of your Jewish identity in any way, which is true for the vast majority of American Jews, then it was an earth-shattering, heartbreaking day that, as I mentioned earlier, we're all still feeling the impacts of. We're still in that pain, we're still in the trauma because the hostages remain, the war hasn't fully ended, and we're all still yearning for a day when both Israelis and Palestinians can finally live in peace and dignity, which feels in many ways farther away than ever right now, even as we look at this sort of fragile ceasefire and hostage deal. And so it's a moment that I think we as Jews viscerally felt. I remember sort of the next day talking, and I think I probably said something about this publicly, about sort of the sort of inherited trauma that many of us carry of seeing Jews pulled from their homes, kidnapped, sexually assaulted, murdered, right? That's something that sort of speaks to the most visceral feelings and history that we carry as Jews. And it was really hard, I think, for a lot of people to understand that for many reasons, because it didn't happen here, it happened in Israel. And if you don't understand, if the royal you doesn't understand the Jewish community's relationship with Israel, sort of how many of us have deep connections to the people, to the land, it might be hard to understand why we all felt it so viscerally. And so there was this narrative, which is partially true and partially not true, that really developed in the aftermath of October 7th, that no one showed up for us. And I want to say it's more complicated than that. First and foremost, I'll say some of the first calls I got after October 7th were from non-Jewish civil rights partners, Black leaders and others who I had worked with, not just in this role, because as I mentioned, I really only started it about a month before October 7th, in terms of trial by fire, I guess. But folks like Maya Wiley, who runs the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the preeminent civil rights coalition. JCPA was one of the founders of that decades ago. Maya and I worked in New York City Hall together. We frequently do a lot of programming together around the intersection of anti-Semitism, racism, and democracy. And she called me on October 8th and said, "How are you doing?" She's like, "I don't know, I don't fully understand or know your relationship with Israel, or if you had family or friends who were impacted, but I can imagine that you're feeling this." And that was all I mean, I don't need people to call me and say, "Hey, I'm going to put an Israeli flag on my front door," or stand with every action that the Israeli government or the IDF takes. I just needed someone to see and understand the pain and the trauma that I was in and that my community was in. And I felt that from a number of people, and I certainly didn't feel it from a number of coalition partners. It was messy, it was complicated, but we're not powerless in this circumstance. I think that we as a community can do a much better job helping potential allies and partners understand why something like October 7th impacted us the way that it did, and help do level setting both within our community and with these potential allies and partners about what allyship actually even means. Because so much of the conversation around Israel and the Jewish community and the term Zionism has become so twisted and so convoluted and removed from the reality that so many of us live in a daily way. So what I need is, again, not for someone to put an Israeli flag on their front door or support every action of the Israeli government. Most American Jews don't support every action of the Israeli government, as is true for most Israelis. I need them to understand our relationship with Israel, why this impacted us the way it did, and to say, hey, we're seeing why the deadliest day for the Jewish community since the Holocaust was so impactful, And most importantly, we're ready to work with you and stand with you here, knowing that it's having ripple effects on your community. And so we can help people do that the same way that we can, the same way that we ask our allies and partners what we can do to support them. It's messy and it's complicated, and particularly when we're talking about terms like Zionism that have become so twisted in the public debate, it's even harder. And so that requires us to lean into these hard conversations, to not walk away from them, despite the fact that some neighbors or friends or colleagues or potential allies and partners messed up or didn't make that phone call on October 8th, or didn't know what to say, or might have even said something that was harmful or problematic or heartbreaking. I think what we need to do as a community is to continue to show up however possible, recognizing that there needs to be red lines. Those that were out there in Times Square or elsewhere celebrating Hamas's mass murder of Jews, I don't think that there is a path forward to engage them. But, a college student who showed up at a campus protest because they wanted to protest for Palestinian rights and they thought that was the only way to do it, and there were harmful things being said and done at that protest that they either didn't understand or weren't personally responsible for, how do we actually engage in a way that gives people grace and helps them understand what it means to show up as an ally and a partner, the same way that we ask them to give us grace when we are trying to show up for them, like, for example, in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it's hard and it's complicated. There's, specific examples I'm happy to talk about, including sort of a very high-profile one we were engaged with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who raises many strong feelings in the Jewish community. And I certainly disagree with her on a number of issues as it relates to Israel and Gaza. But she invited me to have a conversation, a webinar for her social media followers last summer about anti-Semitism. And I said yes, because while she and I have fundamental disagreements on a number of fronts, being able to have that conversation for an audience like hers, it typically doesn't hear from someone like me, someone who identifies as a liberal Zionist, who has a deep personal relationship with Israel. I lived there for a year, who leads a Jewish legacy mainstream organization, right? That's new for them. And we had a long, frank conversation about what it actually means to show up as allies for one another, what anti-Semitism looks like in this moment, what terms like Zionism actually mean to most American Jews versus the twisted way in which it's been portrayed in a lot of the public debate recently. And most importantly, where those red lines are when it comes to the conversation around Israel and where it crosses into anti-Semitism. And the day after this webinar, there was this horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova Memorial in New York, the memorial for the Nova Music Festival, down by Wall Street. And it was so clearly anti-Semitic, or rather it should have been so clearly understood as anti-Semitic. And to her credit, AOC put out a clear, unequivocal statement condemning what happened as anti-Semitic, which was important in and of itself, with her being sort of the most prominent progressive in our politics right now. And it also really created the permission structure for other progressive elected officials to say, hey, maybe there is a space where Israel-related protests cross into anti-Semitism, and we can approach this with some complexity and nuance. A couple weeks later, she was unendorsed by the Democratic Socialists, where they specifically cited her conversation with me and JCPA, which was fascinating. But for me, this was sort of a case study of what we're talking about here. How do we actually engage with people across real lines of disagreement, but in a way that could have real impact? Not because we're always going to agree. I've disagreed with her very publicly since on ways in which she's talked about certain elements of the Israel conversation. But there's also been real ways in which that conversation and our willingness to sit down together has brought us closer together, has brought the conversation to a more constructive place, and has brought new people into the fight against anti-Semitism who otherwise never would have thought they had a place there.
So I hear two themes running through that. one of which is vulnerability, right? Like the need for us to show up with vulnerability and be willing to share and give people a chance to see in and see who we are and what we care about and why. And also, maybe a little bit of managing of expectations, both of ourselves and of other people. Does that feel accurate?
I think that's very accurate. Are you a community relations expert?
Not an expert, but a practicing professional. Thank you. Thank you. So to that, what do you think is the Jewish community's biggest obstacle to forming effective, authentic coalitions and partnerships?
I mean, look, we could probably talk about the litany of obstacles that we're facing right now, because it's not an easy time to be a Jew in America. It's not an easy time to be doing work that's focused on coalition building or community building or inclusive democracy right now. And so we're really getting at from all different directions, including a lot of the pain and the trauma that we're still in. And so I think there's our own sort of internal obstacles where we perhaps have more control. There's external obstacles where I don't know how much control we have. We're 2% of the population, but we certainly have the ability to mobilize and to act. And I think we need to recognize both. In terms of the trauma that I think many of us feel, we need to understand it. We need to recognize it and how it shapes our approach to this work, right? The reaction that many of us have when someone shows up not exactly in the way that we want them to, or when someone engages in the Israel conversation, or otherwise in a way that might be challenging for us. And to be able to understand what's a trauma response versus what is actually a red line that we're not going to engage on, versus how we still, build that muscle to stay at the table, as my friend Eric Ward likes to say, and I'm sure we'll say when he's here next month. How we actually do that in a way that recognizes the very real trauma we as Jews carry, not just for the last year and a half, but sort of in our DNA, given our history, and make sure that it doesn't prevent us from being in the relationships we need to protect and advance our safety here. Externally, it's a little bit more challenging right now. I think we've talked already about the very real anti-Semitism that has increased on the right in one way, on the left in a different way. And obviously right now, with the new landscape on the federal government, however someone voted, there's no denying that the policies that we're seeing coming out of Washington right now are really intended to divide communities, to pit them against one another, and to effectively, in some ways, weaponize our own fears to further break apart the very coalitions we need right now, right? It's the blaming all things bad on diversity or equity, right? A plane crash in DC last week, or foreign aid that has kept communities alive around the globe for years. It's shutting down basic fundamental governmental programs under the guise of, diversity, equity, and inclusion being a bad thing. It's targeting immigrants with mass deportations and raids at houses of worship and schools. It's going after trans kids and the broader LGBTQ community, including the ban just yesterday on trans girls and women in sports. You can go on, and we have to understand that these policies and the broader rhetoric that drives them, the conspiracy theories that so often drive them, this invasion or replacement language that we've been talking about, is ultimately intended to pit our communities against one another. And we can't let that happen, because that is precisely what extremists in all directions want, whether they are extremists on the right seeking to roll back the very democratic norms and rule of law that have been inherent to our safety and the safety of everyone, or whether it's those on the far left who are using Israel to divide our coalitions at a time when they need to be stronger than ever. And so we can't control for what those extremists are going to do, but what we can control for is how we react to it and how we not let it break apart these coalitions at a time when they're so existential. So that's the work that we're doing. We are part of a number of different coalitions, whether it's the Leadership Conference, which I mentioned earlier. We have been doing a lot of work long before the election, since October 7th, with key Jewish and Arab and Muslim partners within the coalition to keep the coalition together post-October 7th. We're part of a bipartisan effort called Bedrock, which came out of the United We Stand Summit hosted at the White House a number of years back. And this is a bipartisan effort to counter hate-fueled violence that brings together diverse communities of all different backgrounds. Just the other week, I joined about a dozen national civil rights leaders at a roundtable focused on how we push back up against efforts to undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as I said in my remarks there, I believe it's not only possible, but actually deeply necessary from a Jewish safety and values perspective to protect diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to advance it in a way that is also inclusive of the Jewish community, our history, and our identities. These things are not at odds with one another. Actually, inclusive democracy is inherent to Jewish safety, and we can teach about Jewish history and Jewish identity as part of that. And so too do we know that when they come for any one community, they're coming for us. We saw just a couple days ago a mandate from the Defense Intelligence Agency, a key federal agency, that effectively banned the commemorations of not just Black History Month, not just Women's History Month, not just Native American History or LGBT or Pride Month, but also Holocaust Remembrance Day. There is no greater example of the fact that these efforts to undermine inclusive democracy are going to come for all of us either way. And even if it's not explicitly coming for the Jewish community, these attacks on the fabric of our democratic norms and values will fundamentally make us less safe, because it's inclusive democracy that's allowed us to thrive in this country. And so we can control what we can control, which is how we respond to these things and how we not let the extremism in all different directions tear apart the relationships and the coalitions that we need right now.
That's a big lift. I mean, it's a heavy ask, and when yes, I absolutely agree. And then I think about your earlier comment about a community, with generations of trauma and more recent trauma and the vulnerability and what it takes to step into a space like that, knowing that you're about to do something really hard, or that you need to do something hard, and that it is process, not product, and it's an ongoing, relationship over many years. So, yeah. You touched on just the whirlwind of the last couple weeks and this flurry of executive orders, many of which remove rights that people and groups rely on for full and equal participation in this country. And you named a bunch of them. And at the same time, President Trump also issued an executive order outlining the forceful and unprecedented steps that his administration is going to take to combat anti-Semitism. So at first glance, it appears that the president is standing up for the Jewish community, even while rights disappear for a number of other marginalized groups. What do we make of that?
Look, there are many people who are going to have very strong opinions about the executive order that the president signed last week related to anti-Semitism, and they're all going to tell you that they're exactly right. Here's what we know. The president is right that we need a whole of government and whole of society approach to anti-Semitism, and in fact, we have a really good rubric for one in the National Strategy to Counter Anti-Semitism that came out about a year and a half ago from the Biden-Harris administration that many of us were deeply engaged in. I was really proud to be a part of that effort. And I will say that strategy, no matter where you fell on sort of the ideological spectrum within the Jewish community, the vast majority of American Jewish organizations and leaders were wholly supportive of that strategy because of how comprehensive it was and how it delineates so many of the policies that many of us have been advocating for years, from protecting students on campus to helping communities understand what discrimination and anti-Semitism look like, to building the very cross-community coalitions and solidarity necessary. And so we actually have a really good rubric for this. This specific executive order, there's certain pieces of it that I hope will be taken to implement that strategy and related policies. But specifically, this executive order seeks to also, of course, sort of take the fear and the pain many of us are feeling, rightfully so, around campus anti-Semitism, and use it to potentially, without due process or basic civil liberties, deport students who violate the term, the basic outlines of what's delineated in the executive order. There's a lot of questions as to how this will actually be implemented, which was one of the core things that we raised in our statement. But here's what we know, which is that it is both possible and necessary to directly and aggressively confront anti-Semitism and to do so in a way that doesn't undermine our fundamental democratic values and the civil liberties and rights that are so important to our safety and to the safety of all communities. And we can do both things. We can confront anti-Semitism on campus without turning to draconian, dehumanizing policies that will ultimately make all of us less safe because of how they undermine the basic norms of our democracy. And so we have a lot of questions about how this is going to be implemented. We've certainly seen sort of a slew of other memos and policies come out since, whether it's the memo I mentioned earlier in which these anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are now being used to directly undermine, again, commemorations of the Holocaust, among other things, to, of course, the now infamous Nazi salute from a very close ally of the president behind the presidential podium on Inauguration Day, someone who then went on to, instead of clarifying, to say, hey, that's not what I actually meant, went on to make some Holocaust jokes online and then spoke to a far-right German party about how we effectively need to get over the Holocaust. And so, we talk a lot about intent and impact in the community relations field. Regardless of the intent of that salute, the impact is clear. And the ripple effects are clear, not just in his own lack of remorse, but particularly in the ways in which it has emboldened and empowered some of the very far-right extremists that we track closely in my last job and that we know are directly responsible for a lot of the anti-Semitic violence and hate that has become so normalized. And so if this administration is serious about confronting anti-Semitism, there's a host of things they can do. They can implement the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. They can reject these leaders and voices like Elon Musk that have directly normalized and trafficked in anti-Semitism. They can stop using dangerous, dehumanizing conspiracy theories rooted in anti-Semitic tropes to go after the immigrant community or the Black community or others. And they also could, not pardon the violent anti-Semitic insurrectionists responsible for a day of violence at our Capitol where people were carrying white supremacist symbols and wearing Camp Auschwitz shirts. So it's hard to balance or perhaps reconcile what they have done with the intent of this executive order, both because, again, if they were serious about countering anti-Semitism, there's a lot that they can do, and the ways in which this executive order appears to effectively juxtapose the fight against anti-Semitism with inclusive democracy rather than recognizing they are inextricably linked.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about coalition building from the perspective of institutions and organizations. What advice would you give individuals, and how can we empower and support lay leaders and our friends and neighbors to lean in?
I mean, in so many ways, what we're talking about here doesn't just apply to organizations or the leaders doing this work. It's actually even more important to do this hard work of relationship and community building on the one-on-one level and the local level. Whatever we do on the national level doesn't matter if we're not actually building the sort of grassroots movement we need to build the sorts of coalitions necessary that recognize Jewish safety is inextricably linked with inclusive democracy. And so it's staying in those hard conversations with the neighbor, the friend, the colleague, the family member who you've had, some real points of disagreement with after October 7th. We know that this is not relegated to conversations between the Jewish community and non-Jews. We know that these very conversations are happening within Jewish families, generationally and otherwise. And how we stay at the table for these conversations is something that all of us can do, because otherwise, again, the extremists are going to succeed in tearing us apart, whether it's tearing apart our families or our own community, where so much of this is playing out, or the broader coalitions that we need. It's also recognizing that the fight against anti-Semitism is the fight for democratic resiliency. And so getting involved, certainly with your local Jewish institutions like the museum and others, and supporting them so that we're doing the education we need, so that we're doing the community building we need on the local level within the Jewish community. And it's also recognizing that that goes hand in hand with building our broader democratic institutions and resiliency. And that is going to be more important than ever on the local level and the state level in the months and years ahead, because it's where we're going to be able to actually have the greatest impact and stop some of the worst policies, or at least mitigate some of the worst policies that are coming out of Washington intended to undercut that democracy and undercut that community resiliency. There's things like teaching media and digital literacy, not just to our kids, but frankly to all of us. We are all living in social media silos where we are sort of getting a constant flow of information that is tailored to reinforce our worst biases and beliefs, to reinforce confirmation bias, to make us feel as if, you know, we are both exactly right all the time, and that we are in many ways entirely alone. It somehow does both of those things at the same time. And we as the Jewish community particularly saw that in the aftermath of October 7th from all different directions. So how we teach media and digital literacy so that we're smarter consumers of the news, and all of us can do this with our kids, with ourselves, educators, caregivers, and others, empowering those of us who are consuming the news and social media in particular to do so in a more thoughtful and deliberate way. And it's just, again, continuing to recognize that this is a process, that we're not, you know, we're in a marathon and not a sprint. I think during the first Trump administration, a lot of it was treated like a sprint. I worked in the New York Attorney General's office then when we were, you know, bringing lawsuit after lawsuit against the Muslim ban or the repeal of DACA or environmental rollbacks or rollbacks of reproductive rights. And I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to do that. And that litigation like that is going to be crucial right now in protecting states and communities around the country. And also we need to recognize that there is a lot of repair work that we need to do, because what we're seeing in this country is not just a flashpoint. It is the symptom of a much darker disease of polarization and normalized extremism that I don't think any of us fully understood or appreciated until recently. And so that means doing the long, hard work in everywhere we can, in our schools, in our houses of worship, in our local interfaith communities, wherever it might be, to rebuild that resiliency and to sort of create some of the firewalls we need against the extremism.
So you and your team do really hard work, and you do a lot of work, not the least of which is supporting Jewish community relations professionals across the country, and I feel really honored and grateful to have been working with your team.
So do we.
Aw,
Sure,
thanks.
thank
But like in the wee hours, what gives you hope? What gives you strength?
There's like shockingly some really nice reasons for hope right now, which is hard. And I have a 2-year-old. Like I'm raising a 2-year-old Jewish kid in America right now, which both a place where I actually find hope because she's blissfully unaware of what's happening in so many ways. And also it's frightening that this is the world I brought her into, right? But there's a lot of reasons for hope. I was just saying to my colleague Rory, who's in the front row, and you all should meet as well if you didn't last night, on the way as we were walking in here, we have these allies and partners that are willing to actually just say yes when we ask them to do something. So whether it's those folks who picked up the phone on October 8th, or the partners that I was texting with on my way in here, where I said, hey, would you do a big program with me on anti-Semitism and democracy? This is a Black civil rights leader, and she said, yeah, like within 2 minutes. And we have people like that who want to show up for us the same way that we show up for them. And it's not limited to, a couple individuals. It's actually far more pervasive than the loudest voices want us to believe, because they thrive on, again, making us feel like we're alone and as if it's the extreme voices that are the majority, when in fact we know it's the opposite, even if it's the extreme voices who are the loudest. And so I found a lot of hope in those partners, whether it's this person I was talking about or the roundtable of civil rights leaders I got to participate in a few weeks ago that included, everyone from the NAACP and the National Urban League to Lilac and immigrant rights groups to Asian American groups to LGBTQ groups. There is more that actually brings us together than the loudest voices would like us to believe. And when we allow ourselves to stay in those spaces and to sometimes be uncomfortable to stay in those spaces, there's actually a lot of reason for hope.
And I would echo that for Tucson as well. I mean, when you talk about what the local landscape looks like, in the last 2+ years that I've been in this role, it seems that people are eager for those opportunities and are just waiting to be asked and are grateful to have a place to convene and to brainstorm and to talk and to listen and to be heard and all those things. And I can see, in many ways that our fear or our anxiety or say our fear of saying the right thing or showing up somewhat awkwardly or whatever it is keeps us from taking that first step, and people are so grateful when we do. And that empowers, like you were saying earlier, like that empowers them to do the same thing, and then it's a good ripple effect and not, yeah. Thank you so very much for this conversation. Let's hear it for Amy. I want to say before we break for questions, oh, look, questions. Thank you. Oh, not yet. A note from my sweetie. Okay, cool. Before we get to questions, I want to say that tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, and that link will go out in the museum's next newsletter, probably on Monday. So if you don't subscribe, please subscribe, and along with that will be some links and some more information that Rabah Rory Picker-Nice has shared as a follow-up to her wonderful conversation last night. So again, heartfelt thanks to Amy and to Rory and JCPA for visiting us in Tucson. Questions are going to be verbal, not on note cards tonight. And you said not?
That's right.
Yeah, okay, far out.
That's right. Hey.
Yes. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, so questions are going to be verbal, not on note cards. So I'm going to be the microphone keeper. And what I'm going to tell you is I need you to be respectful of everybody else's time. Please ask a question. Don't go off on a dissertation. If you do, I might take the microphone back and it'll be awkward for both of us. Okay, I saw your first hand go up. I'm coming to you first.
Thank you for coming to Tucson. You talked about you were on AOC's podcast. To get to the root of anti-Semitism, I think we have to work for the younger people. And I don't know the answer to this, does anybody go on shows like Joe Rogan and the extreme podcast people to reach those younger white people that are prejudiced?
It's a great question. If Joe Rogan wanted to have me on his podcast, I would probably say yes, because I actually think that we need to be engaging people wherever they are. Again, some red lines. Also, am I the right messenger for Joe Rogan's podcast? I don't know. I might be the right messenger for AOC's audience, given the work I did in Charlottesville or elsewhere. So I think we have to think about how we actually engage people, the grass tops voices that we need. And that's actually a lot of the work that we're doing at JCPA, which is to help identify who the right voices are to actually bring the broader communities along that we need. And so as part of a report that I was fortunate to get to write last year with sort of a fascinating diverse coalition of foundations, we did some message research around what are the different ways to actually help different audiences understand anti-Semitism and why it impacts them. And across the board, what we found is that one, democracy-focused messages, which might not even necessarily use the word democracy, but talks about core democratic norms and values, freedoms, rule of law, et cetera, resonated best. And we did some follow-up research that particularly looked at 18 to 34-year-olds, which is the youngest group of Americans you can actually sample. You can't really poll people younger than 18, at least in a helpful way. And what that found is that a lot of what we're talking about here, right, this idea that our safety and our future is deeply interconnected, that hate leads to other hate, that anti-Semitism fundamentally threatens our democratic freedoms and norms and the inclusive, pluralistic democracy we need, is a very resonant message among those populations. And there's a number of different types of credible messengers that we can find, whether they're faith leaders, whether they're veterans, whether they're others. And so this report is on our website. It includes that message research that I talked about. And the work that we're doing at JCPA right now includes working with coalition partners and other allies to empower and engage these voices in communities across the country, whether it's on the national level or in partnership with JCRC's Jewish Community Relations Councils and other local partners around the country, like museums like this one, well, not like this one, we're at the JCC, but museums like that one across town, that Lynn and Lori represent, and how we actually identify those voices in each community who can move their own audiences along. Because, I can talk to the people I can reach, we can each talk to the people we can reach, but we're only gonna be able to move so many people along unless we bring along a broader coalition of messengers and diversify the ecosystem of who is out there talking about the threat of anti-Semitism and helping people understand it.
Thank you. Oh, thank you again. I wanted to follow up on the comment you had made about the executive order on anti-Semitism. I haven't read it all myself, but I appreciate it, and I've read a little bit about it. I was really interested in the story you had told about the student who might have just wandered into that pro-Palestinian demonstration. So I teach at the university. I have a lot of foreign students, and my understanding is if one of my students wandered in, as you mentioned, they'd get deported. So my question is based on no particular evidence, but it would seem that that will lead potentially to even more division on our college campuses and even increase the amount of anti-Semitism. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Look, you are living it firsthand, so I couldn't agree more that if that is how this order is implemented, basically a student that shows up at a protest is automatically deported if they're here on a student visa. That is not only going to be bad for the specific student and the broader communities that'll be targeted, and we know that it'll disproportionately end up targeting students of Arab descent or Palestinian descent or otherwise, but it will ultimately be bad for both the democratic norms and inclusivity that we know is inherent to our safety, and to fueling the very division that allows anti-Semitism to further fester and thrive. And so I wholeheartely agree that if that is how it is actually implemented, and those are the very questions and concerns that we raised in our statement last week, that would be existentially devastating to not just the fight against anti-Semitism, but I think particularly to how we actually repair and rebuild dialogue on college campuses right now. And more broadly, the ways in which what's happening on college campuses is in so many ways symptomatic of the broader polarization we're talking about here. The fact that on the Israel conversation specifically, but certainly more broadly in our politics, everything is treated in a false binary. You're either with Israel or you're against Israel. You're pro-Israel or you're pro-Palestinian. And the vast majority of Americans, including most American Jews, actually can hold complex thoughts. They can support Israel and its right to exist. They can be horrified by what happened on October 7th. They can believe that Hamas is a terrorist organization that should not be in control of Gaza or of the Palestinian people. And they can believe that the Palestinian people are worthy of humanity and dignity, and that the way in which Israel has executed this war has crossed lines, that they can protest for a just, peaceful future that for both people. It's possible to actually hold all of those ideas. But if you look at the dialogue on at least the dialogue about how we talk about college campuses right now, it's not reflective of that complexity. So how we create those spaces on campus and more broadly and reject those zero-sum false binaries that have driven it is precisely what we need to be doing. To your point, if this executive order is implemented in that way, it will only reinforce those false binaries and make it that much harder to repair the harms and the division of the last year and a half.
Thank you for coming, and it's great to see you again. And because it's so good to see you again, I wanted to take issue with one of the things you said, just because we're Jewish. I understand, and I know a lot of students and a lot of teachers about all the challenges we face on the college, not all of them, but the challenges that Jews face on college campuses and certain environments. And you said yourself that it's not an easy time to be a Jew right now. And yet, based on my life and my experience, I would argue that it's never been a better time or a better place to be a Jew than in the United States today. When I was growing up, my parents' generation were getting nose jobs and changing their names because there was structural anti-Semitism back then. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. They couldn't do a lot of things. They couldn't marry a person who they fell in love with, all these things. And now, all of those barriers, we won. I mean, we won in every single one of those battles. And every single one of us could move to Israel if we wanted to, but we don't. I considered it for a while, but we don't. We want to live here because it's great to be a Jew here and it's great to be an American. And I think that, from my point of view, there's none of that in the conversation today in the Jewish community. It's all about victimhood, and the victimhood's very real. I'm not trying to dismiss it. I'm simply saying there's no balance to the conversation, in my opinion, that acknowledges how amazing and wonderful it is to be a Jew in America today.
You know, I think a lot of things can be true at the same time. I think, I grew up at a time where I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I remember thinking for most of my life, until maybe less than a decade ago, how lucky am I to live at this moment in history where what my grandparents went through feels like a piece of history, and we as Jews are here in America where we are safe. And to your point, I think the fear-mongering, this idea that we as Jews are not safe anywhere in the United States or elsewhere is just that, fear-mongering. We are actually very fortunate, and as we've been talking about, I think the ways in which the pluralistic, inclusive democracy that's been at the core of this country has allowed us to thrive in America is exactly the point. The way in which anti-Semitism is manifesting now, to your point, is not in sort of the systemic discrimination that we once faced and that other communities still face, and I would say some Jews face, Jews of color, LGBTQ Jews or others, but rather it's in this sort of insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory that we were talking about, the ways in which, whether it is this invasion or replacement rhetoric, the Soros, the Marxists, the Rothschilds tropes about Jewish control and power, or increasingly post-October 7th, some of these conspiracy theories and tropes on college campus or elsewhere around Zionist or Jewish control and power that ultimately have the impact of leading to the exclusion of Jews or the marginalization of Jews or the isolation of Jews. And so it's manifesting in a very different way than it did a few generations ago, less than a few generations ago. But it is also real, and it's unique. Most other discrimination and hate in America doesn't exist in this way. Most of it is a more overt form of discrimination or prejudice versus, again, this sort of insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory that's anti-Semitism. And part of that is the challenge. That's why it's so hard for people to understand anti-Semitism, and that's why its impacts tend to be different than most other forms of hate. And so I still truly believe that this is the safest place for us as Jews. I also think that what we're seeing now has the potential impact of changing that, and how we need to fight like crazy to protect the democratic norms and the values and the safety that has made this the safest place for Jews in our history is on all of us.
I'm going to insert a question, if I may. As you carry this message and this conversation across the country that Jews and other marginalized communities, it's that Jews and piece, right, that I think is often left out, that Jews and other marginalized communities are only safe, can only thrive in a robust civil society. How is it received? Like, do people get it? Do you get pushback? What's it sound like? What's it look like?
Look, again, despite the loudest voices, I will say the vast majority of people, Jews or otherwise, actually understand the importance of inclusive democracy. And if you look at polling, it'll tell you that the issue that Jews say they voted on more than anything is not Israel, and it's not the economy, and it's not, although the economy certainly comes before Israel in many of these surveys, it's actually democracy. And many Americans are saying the same thing. So there's, I think particularly as Jews, sort of something in our gut that reminds us that inclusive democracy is inherent to our own safety, and we know precisely where attacks on inclusive democracy lead. And that's why we consistently, say that that is what we are voting on. Those are the values and the policies that we're going to fight for. And even if you look at sort of the exit polling and other data from the 2024 election, it seems to affirm that Jews were showing up for democracy and for those values of inclusivity and pluralism. So, I think we as a community, the average Jew, understands that. The louder voices are maybe not telling that story, and that's true both within the Jewish community in certain spaces, and it's certainly true in the broader conversation right now. And so, for me, another place I find hope actually is in events like this and conversations like this, which I've been really fortunate to have around the country over the last few years. Because, look, if you're coming to something like this, you're probably self-selecting to care about these issues. But also, I've been fortunate to talk to audiences of very diverse backgrounds and ideologies on college campuses and K through 12 schools and red states and blue states and purple states. And the vast majority of people actually seem to get it. Not because I'm telling them something they didn't know, but because we're actually, it's all built into our DNA to actually understand where a lot of this can lead, particularly as Jews, but I think many other marginalized communities as well. And it's just a matter of reminding each other that the most extreme voices and the loudest voices are not actually reflective of where most of us are.
Two quick questions back to back. You mentioned that the legal strategy is going to be very important, and we followed you during the Charlottesville case. Who's going to be taking up the charge as far as the legal support for these cases? Second question, you made very clear sort of the what in the allyship building and the education. Are there any particular strategies in the K through 12 space that you have seen very recently that you think are successful?
Great questions. On the legal front, look, there's so much to say here. I would say, one, state AGs are still critical. They are the front lines, and many of them have already brought lawsuits. There's also sort of the private bar, including nonprofits like Democracy Forward or others that are effectively coordinating litigation. We've already played a connective role helping sort of houses, like certain Jewish leaders or others connect with folks related to some of the ways in which, for example, immigration raids are going to be happening at synagogues and other houses of worship according to these executive orders. And so there's a very real stake that our local communities have in this, and how we can also show up as either plaintiffs or in filing amicus briefs is going to be important. And so both on the governmental side through state AGs and on the private bar side through some of these nonprofit organizations and the broader civil rights community, there's a lot that's happening already, including some of the litigation that has blocked things like the funding freeze or the attack on birthright citizenship or otherwise. And I think a lot more to come. And again, we can't understand this as an issue of simple partisan politics, right? A lot of these policies are fundamentally at odds with our basic constitutional rights, and the courts are still largely agreeing with that, which is important. On the second question about K through 12 schools, so there's a few things to say. I think, there's a lot of conversation around curriculum and how we teach the Holocaust. Certainly, locally, the museum is a critical resource in that, and there's a lot of important work that's been done to both understand and evolve how we teach the Holocaust and how it fits into teaching modern contemporary anti-Semitism and connecting the dots there. So it's not taught as sort of an isolated moment in time, but rather something that we can actually learn from and connect the dots with to today. And so there's different, specific curriculum. We are involved in a few specific efforts. For example, the Weitzman, which is a museum in Philadelphia, hopefully I think going to be a Smithsonian technically soon, is doing its own work on this front that Rory is on the advisory board for, and we as an organization are trying to be supportive of, particularly with helping bring a democracy lens to that. And we also just launched a partnership with the American Federation of Teachers, which is the national teachers union, where we are doing a few things. We're working specifically with union leaders, who are those very sorts of grass tops voices we've been talking about, who can then bring messages to their own local communities to empower and engage them in understanding anti-Semitism in all of its forms, including why it is a threat to inclusive democracy. And we've been really fortunate to get to work with them, with Randy Weingarten, who is, I think, a fantastic leader in sort of bringing the complexity of these issues to the fore. And we're also, as part of that partnership, doing a lot of work to sort of support local communities in building more constructive conversations and relationships between the local affiliates and the local Jewish community, where relationships have been frayed in certain places, or again, extreme voices have kind of dominated the conversation. And fundamentally, we know that, again, understanding, teaching anti-Semitism and Jewish safety and history as an issue of inclusive democracy is not only actually factual, but also the ways in which we can engage new people, including younger Americans, in this. And so we're working with a number of partners within the Jewish community and within the teachers union space and otherwise to try some different things here, and to see if we can help move the needle a little, rooted in research, rooted in what we've learned. And we're in not normal times, and so it means not just leaning on what we know works, but also continuing to innovate and find new approaches with willing partners. And so we're trying to do a little bit of both, and I know others in the community are as well.
Hello. As a lifetime educator, I really appreciate that question and that answer. I'm a brown man from Tucson and a Jew from Tucson. Until recently, I've received way more hate for being brown than for being Jewish. I don't know if it's a question, so I apologize, but I'll try to make it a question. I'll fight you for it. I'll be quick, though. I guess I just want you to kind of restate or give your thoughts, because I really appreciate the conversation. What I'm trying to voice is Jews are feeling the trauma of October 7th and many other things right now, as you voiced. Latinos are feeling a ton of trauma, from Operation Wetback to, you just go through the history of these deportation things, to just seeing police officers or Border Patrol and feeling all of the tension that brings. African Americans, you brought up 2020 and George Floyd. My point, to make it a question, is we are not at our best when we are scared. We are not at our best. So we're trying to have this very cerebral conversation, and we're trying to ask people to be logical, and we're trying to ask everybody to show up as their best selves, but we're not our best selves. And it's purposeful, I would argue, on the other side, to have us be scared and have us be divided and have us not be our best self. So I guess if there's a question, it's we really need to show up with grace for ourselves and the other groups. But again, we need these other groups. If we're just a bunch of over 50 white people talking about Jewish issues, and I'm sorry if that's offensive, but that's my experience, again, almost in this room again, we're not going to have the power that we need, and we're not going to make the connections that we need. We need that empathy to realize the trauma that's real for us is real for them too. And we're not at our best when we're in trauma.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I will say, one, I'm the daughter of two lifelong public school teachers, and so appreciate your service and the broader, I imagine there are other educators in this room based on some of the questions, and it's one of the reasons why getting to do this work, and particularly some of the work we're doing with AFT, is so meaningful for me personally. And you're exactly right? And I think it's really hard on multiple levels. I think one, both within the Jewish community and outside of it, we talk about the Jewish community as a monolith, which ignores the diversity of the Jewish community and the fact that many in the Jewish community are facing compounding forms of hate and extremism right now, whether it's Jews of color, whether it's immigrant or refugee Jews, LGBTQ Jews, or so much more. And our community is not a monolith ideologically, and it's also not a monolith in any other sense. And how we better tell that story and make sure our institutions are serving the real rich diversity of the Jewish community is crucial. And that means not just understanding the deeply interconnected nature of hate, and the term intersectionality has been so twisted. I was with Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined it at this roundtable a few weeks ago, and sort of just talking to her about the actual intention of the term was like another place I found hope. But it's things from it's not just helping people understand that, but it's also thinking about very real impacts of policies, right? To your point, if synagogues are posting swarms of police outside their doors right now, what does that say to Latino Jews or to Black Jews? And how do we keep ourselves safe? Because we do require real physical security right now, given the threats we face. And how do we do so in a way that isn't simply about building walls and putting up barriers and prosecuting or suing our way out of this crisis, but fundamentally building the resiliency to understand that despite the pain and the trauma and the fear that we're in, it's going to take us staying at the table and building those coalitions and figuring out how we do this in as inclusive a way as possible. And it's hard and it's messy and it's not easy. And I know for myself included, it's really easy to sit in that trauma and the pain all day, every day. I open up my social media for like 5 minutes at the end of the day, and I immediately want to throw my phone out the window and give up, particularly right now. And I think it's reminding ourselves and building that own personal resiliency, and perhaps getting off social media as much as possible, frankly. And then also continuing to show up in spaces where we're going to have the partnerships and the resiliency and the support that we need to keep doing this work, because it's a marathon and not a sprint right now. And it's going to be so much harder as the weeks and the months go on.
We're going to take one more question. So, Rabbi, you better make it a good one.
Okay. So I have also a traumatized group that I'd like to ask you a specific question about. If we believe that for people to accuse American Jews for what is going on in Israel and how the Israel Defense Force is doing things, and they're looking at us and they're saying we're bad, that's anti-Semitic. So the traumatized group that we have in our community and communities across the country are Jewish parents whose kids are anti-Semitic under that definition. Because we have kids who are my kids' age, in their 20s and 30s, who are looking at their parents and blaming their parents for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. So no one is helping these parents talk to their kids or have their kids help understand. It's lovely to have coalition building, but we have Jewish parents and Jewish kids who are quote unquote acting anti-Semitically toward them, and other Jewish adult Americans who are supporting Israel, however you define that, but who are accusing us of being on the wrong side of this issue. Sounds like anti-Semitism to me from our kids. How do we respond to that? How do we help these parents?
Yeah. Well, look, the divides within the Jewish community in so many ways are just reflective of the broader divides that we're talking about here. And I'll say a few things. I think, one, I'm probably among the last generation of American Jews that understands Israel in the way that I do, that has the relationship with Israel that I do, right? I grew up at a time when Israel was still facing very real threat. The Second Intifada was very formative to my personal relationship with Israel. I moved there a few years later. I studied at Hebrew University, where the cafeteria had been bombed just a few years before. I was told by everyone, don't get on the bus. I still took a bus every day. But it was a very different Israel that I grew up developing a relationship with. Younger American Jews, the only Israel they know is one that has been largely safe, except for October 7th, and that has largely been led by Bibi Netanyahu, who, however you feel about him, you can imagine that has an impact on their understanding of Israel. And so it's important to understand that their perception of Israel is fundamentally different than mine, for example, as someone who's like a little bit older than them, and certainly as that of most people in this room, I would suspect. And in particular, the ways in which for so long this conversation has been painted in zero-sum false binaries, as we talked about earlier, has only reinforced that in certain ways. It's really made it harder for younger American Jews to sort of see how they can engage with Israel in a way that grapples with that complexity. And it effectively says, you're either with the Israeli government or, you're over there in the anti-Israel protest. We need to create spaces to grapple with that complexity. We need to think about ways in which we can have conversations within our families and within our community that reflects that complexity. I know that, for example, Encounter, which is a great organization that does work sort of helping bringing Jewish leaders to sort of see the complexity of the conflict, they just did an intergenerational trip where they brought I think largely college-aged or young adult kids and their parents to Israel and the West Bank to learn and to see firsthand the conflict and to grapple with the conflict in a way that was far more nuanced than they typically were. And I talked to some high-profile rabbis and other folks who were on that trip, and they said it was extraordinary. And the people on this trip were not people who I think sort of came into it without strong opinions. These are people who had very strong opinions going in. And in many ways that was, it was more remarkable that they were able to sort of grapple with that complexity. And we need to be able to do that within our own community and create space and grace to do that so that younger American Jews and frankly younger Americans more broadly feel like they can engage on Israel in a way that is complex and nuanced and that doesn't cross the line into what would be anti-Semitic or even anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, because again, those terms mean something fundamentally different than I think they're portrayed in so much of the public conversation, and how we can actually help people understand what Zionism means to each of us and engage in that complexity is the only way we're actually going to be able to keep our community whole and do the broader work that we need to do. And that space just hasn't really existed in so many places for so long.
Thank you all again for being here this evening. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and your engagement, and thank you, Amy.